Yarn hauls, yarn stash, yarn hoarding, a little bit controversial, but definitely high emotion. So let's kind of get philosophical about it. Hey folks, it's Mary, aka MercyTriumphs, and this is Slow Crochet. Today I want to talk about a topic that kind of relates to having a yarn stash, but it's actually kind of a broader sense of what it means to be human. So yes, this is another kind of philosophy of creativity and yarniness. I'm putting this under the category of philosophy of yarn. Now, this topic really got percolating in my brain when I watched a video by my friend Shannon over at Shannon Talks Yarn. So often, rather than just filling up her comment section with an essay, I realized, hey, let me just make a separate video, and it kind of creates this little dialogue back and forth. So in her video, she was addressing a scarcity mentality when it comes to buying yarn, especially buying yarn that's on sale or on clearance. And so as she was talking about this, I was reminded of a couple of different things that aren't really directly related to yarn, but they're more related to kind of how we process our reality and our sense of worth and our sense of well-being in this modern world. So I wanted to kind of address that and hopefully provide you with some encouragement and some perspective. So the first point that I want to address actually came from a video I was watching that was completely not connected at all to yarn, but it was talking about why our modern society tends to have an issue with hoarding or just hanging on to stuff, and kind of talking about the concept of storage units. If you are not in the United States, I'm not sure if it's like this where you are, but here in the States, we have this phenomenon called storage units. And what that means is you rent out space, like a room in a specified building that's climate controlled perhaps, and it's where you put all of your excess stuff that does not fit in your home. So on the one hand, these things are really helpful, like if you're moving from one house to another and you need some transition time perhaps in your living arrangements. But on the downside, it can mean that if you have this storage unit, it means you physically have so much stuff, so many things that you do not have space for it in your home. And so they were talking about this phenomenon and how it really is this modern problem. But when you look at the course of human history, this is not the case. Our ancestors had relatively few items compared to what we have today. For me, a great comparison is the Laura Ingalls Wilder books of Little House on the Prairie, and a family moves in their Conestoga wagon across the country and they build their house from scratch, and everything that they have is handmade and valued and very treasured. Every plate is really valuable. Every spoon is really valuable. Every little bookcase is handmade. Every book, there's maybe only 6 or 7 books that are mentioned throughout the series that belong to this family. And that's just one little example. But you think about all of human history, even before the late 1800s, and it's kind of a similar story. So the point that that presenter was making and comparing kind of those previous times with where we are now actually had to do with how humans are programmed to spend our time making sure that we have the resources that we need to survive. So what are the basic needs? We need shelter, we need clothing, we need food. How much of our ancestors' time and energy was spent in acquiring food, storing food, preserving food, making sure that they had what they needed when they needed it, making sure that they had warm clothes, making sure that they could stay alive. And so that whole survival mechanism is what triggers that kind of hoarding idea. Think back generation to generation to generation. Our traits are passed on, our hair color, our eye color, our stature, our bone structure, all these different things. Even the idea that the people that survived the bubonic plague, the Black Death in the Middle Ages, they survived to pass on their traits so that the people coming after them are not going to be as susceptible to that disease, right? Same thing with the hoarding idea. In modern times, we have factories, we have the Industrial Revolution, we have access to so many things, But what hasn't happened is we haven't had enough generations in that time of plenty to really be able to adjust those generations of propensities toward these behaviors and these traits that are going to help us stay alive. So what if our thoughts on our yarn stash, or feeling guilty that we've gone and shopped a sale and we don't really need those things, or even the feeling of shame that we have so much and yet we're buying more? What if we could recognize that that's actually a survival skill that's kind of been ingrained into us, and that if our ancestors hadn't had those skills or hadn't had those natural inclinations towards them, they would not have survived to produce us. The more I learn about history, the more I have come to realize people of the past had the same struggles, the same issues, and the same tendencies, and the same ability to think and be creative. Now, they might not have had the same energy to spend on something as luxurious as crochet, but they had the same ingenuity, problem solving, desire for beauty, desire for solid relationships, desire to stay alive and to enjoy life. And so those traits that kept them alive and allowed them to have children, which eventually had children, which bring us to who we are, if they hadn't hoarded or got things at a good deal or made hay while the sun shines or anything like that, we would not be here. So in some ways, I wonder if we are a bit harsh on ourselves because we think maybe it was just the way that we were raised, or maybe it was our grandparents' generation, or maybe even it was the generation that came up during the Great Depression or something like that. But what if it actually goes much deeper than that? What if our tendency to gather yarn at a good price, what if we didn't have to feel shame over that because we recognized that trait that hangs on to that yarn, that trait actually helped our ancestors to survive, and it brought us here? What if we can actually be reconciled to that? Maybe that could help us with feeling guilty or feeling ashamed or feeling embarrassed. Maybe we can understand ourselves a little bit better if we see us in the context of human history and say, hey, I'm behaving the same way that my ancestors did, only I have my basic needs met, so that same behavior is coming out more in the luxury of yarn craft and crochet. Another idea kind of related to this is the tendency that humans have towards novelty. It's not wrong to want a new color or a new texture, or to say, hey, that's a really great price. I don't know what I'll use that for, but I'm going to grab it just in case I need it. I might find just the right thing. Dietitians have identified this in the way that we approach food, that humans are drawn to novelty. And there's this balance between understanding where to go to get what you need, whether it's the brambles that are producing blackberries or the salt lick where the animals are going to come to make for good hunting. We are aware of our surroundings and we're constantly on the lookout for that novelty. And it's also kind of a danger thing too, right? We are attracted to novelty, something new in the environment, because we are hungry to learn more. We always want to be aware of what's going on. And so there's almost a safety mechanism in that we are attracted to novelty and we want to experience and understand and learn new things. And that's also kind of an adaptive measure as well, because what if for one reason or another that berry patch gets dug up and it's no longer producing? We're always having to look for the next piece of where we're going to get our needs met. So that even applies to novelty yarn, or perhaps buying yarn at a good price that we wouldn't have thought of before. So if that's something that you struggle with, maybe give yourself a little bit of grace, because you are acting in a way that all of our ancestors in human history have done, only we're not doing it to get our basic needs met. We're using that same mechanism and applying it to our yarn buying and our stash buying and our hobbies. We have a choice. We can let that define us, or we can choose a different path. So the question is, how do we feel when we're buying yarn, when we're shopping sales? Is it a fear of missing out? What is that fear? That fear maybe is saying that you won't have what you need when you need it. And you can kind of probe that fear and ask, maybe where did that come from? But it's our hearts that motivate us. It's our feelings. If I'm driving down the road and I know that there's a yarn sale going on, and I know that my schedule is full, I do not have time to stop, but I'm getting that almost anxious feeling. You know, this is a true story. Like, I'll find myself driving and, I should get off the interstate now and see what that yarn sale is doing. And I start to get anxious. And so in that moment, I have some options. I can go back and say, okay, why am I feeling this way? What is the beginning point of that feeling? Do I want that feeling to drive my car, literally take the turn and get off the interstate? Or do I want to make a different choice, knowing that I don't have money in the budget right now, and I actually don't have the time either. Sometimes time is more valuable than money. So in that feeling, what do I do? Do I let that take the wheel, or do I stop? And do I say, we need to revisit this feeling because it's actually not rational. It's not something that makes sense in my world. This panic, this need to control, that's not who I am. That's not who I want to be. I don't want this to be part of my future. So my encouragement in all of this to you is just to know that, number one, we as people, we make sense. What we do makes sense, not only in the course of human history, but also within the course of our lives. There are things that we do today that come from deep places in us. Oftentimes we see the behaviors, and that leads us back to what the feelings were. So I would encourage you, if you're feeling guilt, if you're feeling shame, if you're feeling fear of missing out, fear that you're not going to have enough, I would encourage you to take a minute and either thank your ancestors. You don't have to go visit a cemetery, but just realize we have a lot to be thankful for, that we are the way we are because our ancestors were able to pass these traits on to us that helped us survive. And then maybe we can say, hey, thank you, great-grandmother, that you've taught me to save well, but I don't need you to protect me anymore. I get to make my own choices now. I am not you, and so I don't have to do what you did. But I really appreciate that you're part of who I am. Hopefully you found this interesting. Even more hopefully you found this comforting or encouraging. I know this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, and maybe it provokes more questions than it does answers. But I do want you to know that yarn stash and yarn sales, it is kind of a sticky subject because we do have a lot of emotion attached to it one way or another. And that's actually quite normal. This means a lot to us as artists, as craftspeople, as creators. Our art forms do matter. We have a lot of passion about it. We have a lot of emotion attached to it, and that's okay. You are who you are on purpose and for a purpose. And I'm certainly thankful that you've spent a little bit of your time with me. If I'm not your cup of tea, thank you so much for listening this long. I do appreciate you, and I do hope I'll see you again soon. Bye.